A Roman legion wipes a tribe from the map before sunset. A king's head is raised on a spear. 600 women kneel in the mud. But Rome did not realize it had captured something far more dangerous than a defeated queen. Brenia, priestess, mother, strategist, stands at the center of a system designed to break royal women publicly and completely. Stripped of her crown, surrounded by enemies, betrayed by blood, she faces a choice that will decide the fate of her sons and the survival of a hidden resistance Rome believes it has already destroyed. This is not just a story of brutality. It is a story of calculation inside captivity, of a queen who turned fear into leverage, and of the silent war that history never recorded. Because sometimes the most dangerous rebellion is the one that survives. Kings were killed, queens were broken, but some stories refuse to die. If you crave real dark history, like, subscribe, and don't look away. The head on the spear. Rome did not just kill kings, it erased nations, slowly, deliberately, publicly. But on that frozen morning, Rome made one mistake. The blood drying across Brenia's cheek did not belong to her husband. It belonged to one of the Roman soldiers who had fallen before the Nurvian shield wall finally collapsed. She had been standing beside King Bodognatus when the final charge broke. She had watched the line fracture. She had seen the Roman formation close like iron jaws. 3 hours later, her husband's severed head stood mounted above the prisoner enclosure, tilted slightly, as if still surveying his defeated people. 600 Nurvian women knelt in the mud beneath it. The February wind bit through torn linen and exposed skin. Roman soldiers moved between the captives with the quiet discipline of men performing routine labor. There was no drunken chaos, no uncontrolled frenzy. This was organized, systematic, efficient. Young women were pulled to one side, elderly women to another, children separated without ceremony. Noble jewelry was stripped, braids were cut, names were ignored. The Romans were not merely conquering a tribe, they were categorizing it. Brenia remained perfectly still as a legionary yanked the bold torque from her neck, the symbol of her sovereignty. It snapped against bone before coming free. He pocketed it without comment. She did not react. Fear would be expected. Sobbing would be tolerated. Defiance would be punished. Stillness, however, that unsettled men who believed they understood power. Across the enclosure stood Legatus Gaius Cornelius Scipio. He did not shout, he did not strike, he simply observed. His armor gleamed despite the ash drifting through the air. His crimson commander's cloak hung untouched by mud. His gaze lingered on Brenia longer than on any other captive. Not with lust, not yet, with assessment. He had conquered tribes before. He knew the value hierarchy of defeat. Common women would be sold in bulk, skilled women auctioned individually, noble wives kept as rewards. But queens were something else. Queens were symbols, and symbols had to be broken carefully. When Scipio finally moved, the camp parted around him. He stopped before Brenia and tilted his head slightly, studying her as though she were an artifact excavated from ruins. "The Queen of the Nurvi," he said in crisp Latin, "wife of Bodognatus, priestess of the grove." His knowledge struck harder than any blow. Someone had spoken. A soldier hauled her to her feet. Her wrists were bound tightly behind her back. The rope bit deeper as she walked. She did not struggle. Resistance would mean immediate death, and death would abandon her sons. They were missing, hidden before the battle turned, hidden somewhere only a handful of initiated Druids understood. Only she knew the final layer of protection. Only she knew the last movement made before Roman scouts breached the grove. If she died, the line of Nurvian sovereignty died with her. Inside Scipio's command tent, civilization mocked the ashes outside. Carpets, bronze lamps, scrolls, and military maps. Wine poured into silver cups while bodies still smoldered beyond the canvas walls. Scipio circled her slowly. "You understand your position," he said calmly. "Your husband is dead. Your warriors are dead. Your nation is finished." Finished. The word echoed, not as grief, but as challenge. He continued, "What remains is property, treasure, information, heirs." There it was. Not cruelty for pleasure, extraction. He wanted the treasury hidden before dawn. He wanted the sacred artifacts burned from the grove. He wanted the location of her sons, leverage to ensure obedience. And he wanted something more dangerous than gold. He wanted the Druid network. The underground channels that Rome believed it had annihilated during earlier campaigns. The safe houses, the coded routes, the silent couriers who moved through forests unseen. Scipio's eyes sharpened. "You will cooperate," he said evenly, "or you will be persuaded." Outside, a cheer rose from soldiers celebrating victory. Brenia imagined what persuasion meant inside Roman camps for captured queens. She had heard enough whispered details to understand. But she also understood something Scipio did not. Systems require predictability, and predictability can be manipulated. She lowered her gaze just enough to appear broken, just enough to let him believe she was calculating survival, not revenge. He thought he held every advantage: military dominance, physical power, information from captured warriors. He thought fear would force confession. He was wrong, because while Rome had perfected the art of conquering bodies, it underestimated something far more dangerous: a queen who had nothing left to lose. And as Scipio poured wine and began outlining the terms of her cooperation, Brenia made a decision that would turn the machinery of Rome against itself. She would give him information, just not the truth. And by the time the legions realized the game had begun, the cost of capturing the queen of the Nurvi would be far greater than they ever anticipated. Outside, the wind carried the scent of smoke and iron across a conquered land. Inside the tent, a war more dangerous than the battlefield quietly began. The ritual of erasure. Rome did not merely enslave queens, it staged their humiliation as proof of divine order. And every conquered bride became part of a ritual older than mercy. By nightfall, the battlefield had transformed into administration. Fires burned in controlled rows, tents stood in disciplined symmetry, and scribes moved between officers, recording inventories of men, livestock, weapons, and women. The Roman Empire did not leave conquest to improvisation. It had procedures, it had categories, it had a system for what happened next. Brenia learned that system quickly. From beyond the thin canvas of her assigned tent, she heard the rhythms of processing. Names were not asked, origins were barely noted. Instead, value was assessed: age, health, teeth, bearing, skill. A woman who could weave fine wool was marked differently from one who could not, a brewer differently from a farmer's wife. Each was classified according to potential profit. But queens were not evaluated for profit alone. queens were theater. The wives of defeated tribal chiefs occupied the highest rung of a grim hierarchy. They represented sovereignty captured alive. Their public degradation served a strategic purpose: to demonstrate that no throne beyond Rome's authority held legitimacy. When a queen knelt, the myth of her people's independence collapsed with her. Brenia had heard stories of Roman triumphs, the ceremonial parades through the capital where conquered rulers were dragged in chains before cheering crowds, men executed at the end of the procession, women spared but not freed, displayed, renamed, absorbed into Roman households as living proof that resistance ended in submission. What history rarely recorded were the weeks before those parades. In legionary camps across Gaul and Britannia, special quarters were set aside for high-status captives. Officers dined well in the evenings, celebrating victory with wine and rhetoric about civilization. Hospitality required entertainment. Entertainment required access, and access, in Rome's legal language, was ownership. Brenia understood now why the soldiers had stripped her not only of jewelry, but of markers of identity. Her braided crown had been cut loose, her sacred markings washed away. Without regalia, without symbols, she was easier to redefine. Rome excelled at renaming what it conquered. The tent assigned to her stood closer to the command center than to the common prisoners. Privacy, though minimal, signaled conditional value. She was not yet inventory for market sale. She was a negotiation in progress. Late into the night, laughter rose from officers' quarters. Not drunken chaos, structured indulgence. Brenia listened to the cadence of Latin voices discussing distribution. A skilled metalworker's wife reserved for a centurion. A chieftain's daughter promised to a visiting magistrate. It was done without overt cruelty, as though dividing spoils were an administrative necessity rather than a human catastrophe. Fear moved through her in waves, but she disciplined it into clarity. Greed drove Rome, not only for gold, but for dominance, spectacle, affirmation of superiority. If she could identify what Scipio valued most, she could weaponize it. At dawn, she was summoned again. Scipio stood over a table scattered with maps recovered from the burned grove. Some were incomplete. Others charred. He did not look at her immediately. "You understand," he began evenly, "that your position protects you for now. That protection is conditional." Conditional meant temporary. He explained the hierarchy as though instructing a student. Common captives sold, skilled captives auctioned, nobles gifted, queens retained. The implication was unmistakable. The higher the status, the more deliberate the humiliation. "You may survive," he said, "if you remain useful." Remain useful. The phrase echoed like a sentence. But Brenia had observed something crucial. Scipio was cautious. He had not yet released her to the entertainment cycle. That meant uncertainty. That meant he suspected she possessed information not yet extracted. Curiosity restrained cruelty, and curiosity could be fed, slowly. She met his gaze with calculated restraint, allowing vulnerability to flicker just enough to appear genuine. She spoke of minor cache sites, of routes abandoned years earlier. Enough truth to build credibility, enough misdirection to delay verification. As she spoke, she felt the weight of insecurity pressing against her resolve. Every word risked exposure. Every omission risked retaliation. But shock had sharpened her instinct. Past belief in simple heroism no longer applied. This was not battlefield honor. This was survival inside a machine designed to grind identity into dust. When she finished, Scipio studied her in silence. "If you deceive me," he said quietly, "you will regret the creativity of my disappointment." The threat was calm, professional. Outside, a Roman standard snapped in the wind, its eagle glinting in cold light. Around it, the camp functioned with terrifying order, a civilization that believed its expansion was destiny. But Brenia now saw the fault line. Rome believed humiliation guaranteed obedience. It did not yet understand what humiliation could ignite. And somewhere beyond the perimeter, unseen by legionary patrols, embers from the burned grove still smoldered beneath the ash. Rome had begun its ritual of erasure. It had no idea the ritual was about to be interrupted.
The hand that betrayed. The greatest wound was not carved by Roman steel. It was written in familiar handwriting. And when Brenia saw the map, something inside her turned colder than grief. The third morning after the fall of the Nurvi began with unusual silence. Roman camps were rarely quiet. They pulsed with discipline and routine, armor clinking, orders carried, boots striking frozen earth. But this silence felt different, concentrated, deliberate. It reached Brenia before the summons did. She was escorted to Scipio's command tent under heavier guard than before. No words were exchanged. No unnecessary glances were permitted. Whatever had shifted, it was no longer subtle. Inside, the air felt taut. Scipio stood beside a large wooden table. Spread across it was a detailed map, parchment smooth, lines precise, annotations written in a script Brenia recognized instantly. She did not need to step closer. She did not need confirmation. It was her brother's hand. Caddoc. Her younger brother, initiated beside her into the deeper rites of the sacred grove, the one who had memorized treasury locations, safe house routes, coded contact points, the one she believed had fallen during the battle's final collapse. He was alive, and he had spoken. Scipio did not shout. His composure was worse than rage. "You miscalculated," he said evenly. "You assumed you were the sole guardian of your people's secrets." He gestured to the map. Roman officers stood nearby, watching her face with predatory interest, searching for confirmation of authenticity. "We recovered this last night. Your brother proved pragmatic." Pragmatic. The word echoed like insult disguised as sophistication. Brenia forced her expression into neutrality, though inside something fractured. Fear pulsed first, fear for what Caddoc might have revealed, then anger, then something more corrosive, understanding. She knew what Roman persuasion meant. She knew the cost of defiance. Survival could twist conviction into confession. Still, betrayal cut differently when it shared your blood. Scipio traced a finger along the map. The treasury is already secured, the artifacts cataloged, the grove's remaining safe houses identified. Each revelation stripped away leverage she had carefully constructed. Every advantage she had balanced against Roman power collapsed under ink. "What remains," Scipio said softly, "is the network. The Druid's channels hidden beneath the appearance of defeat. The messengers disguised as traitors. The coded signals carried in carved symbols and seasonal rituals. Caddoc had known locations, but not everything. Contact protocols remained fragmented, and that fragment now rested with her."
You can still be valuable, Scipio said, or you can join the others. The implication required no elaboration. For a brief moment, insecurity threatened to break her composure. The system she believed she could manipulate had adapted faster than expected. Rome did not rely solely on brutality. It exploited fracture lines within the conquered. Greed, fear, desperation. But shock sharpened her thinking. If Caddoc had bargained for survival, then factions within the Roman command had already engaged in negotiation. That meant internal division. That meant competing interests, and competing interests could be played against one another. "Where is my brother?" she asked, voice steady. "Alive," Scipio replied. "Relocated. His usefulness has concluded." Relocated. The vagueness chilled her more than certainty would have. She shifted her gaze back to the map, then met Scipio's eyes without flinching. "You believe possession of locations equals control. It does not." A flicker of irritation passed across his features. "Without trust," she continued evenly, "your information decays. Safe houses abandoned, contacts severed, routes altered. You may possess yesterday's map. Tomorrow will not resemble it." Curiosity replaced irritation. She had struck a nerve. Past belief in straightforward domination had limits. Rome understood conquest. It did not fully understand fluid resistance. Scipio stepped closer. "You presume to threaten?" "No," she answered calmly. "I am explaining the challenge." Silence hung between them. Around the tent, Roman officers watched with restrained anticipation. They expected pleading or collapse. Instead, they saw calculation. Fear remained present. She felt it in the tightening of her chest, but it no longer controlled her. The game had shifted from deception to leverage through instability. She could not reclaim lost secrets, but she could make them unreliable. Outside the tent, the Roman eagle banner caught the wind, snapping sharply against the sky. Inside, something more dangerous than battle unfolded. Scipio believed he had broken her advantage. He had not realized he had just revealed his own vulnerability. And as Brenia was escorted back under guard, one certainty settled into place. Blood could betray, but systems could still be fractured, and Rome had just exposed the first crack. The network beneath the ash. Rome believed it had burned the sacred grove to the ground. But ash does not mean extinction. Sometimes it means concealment. The grove had been reduced to charcoal and bone, its ancient oaks felled, its altar stones cracked open by Roman hammers, its relics seized and catalogued like curiosities in a traveling exhibition of empire. To the legionaries, the destruction signified closure. To Scipio, it meant strategic success. The spiritual backbone of the Nurvi had been dismantled. Resistance, in theory, had no center left to gather around. But Rome misunderstood something fundamental about belief. Belief does not reside in trees, it resides in memory. From within her guarded tent, Brenia replayed every initiation rite she had endured as both queen and priestess. The rituals had never depended on a single location. The grove had been sacred, yes, but it had also been a signal, a visible center that distracted from the invisible web surrounding it. The Druids were not naive. They had survived centuries of tribal warfare before Rome ever appeared on the horizon. They had built redundancy into survival. Safe houses existed in farmsteads beyond Roman patrol routes. Coded messages traveled in seasonal market exchanges. Carved symbols etched into seemingly decorative jewelry signaled allegiance. The grove's destruction would force adaptation, but it would not extinguish the network. If anything, it would compress it into quieter forms. That was what Scipio feared. He had recovered locations from Cadix Rap, but locations were static. Networks were living, and living systems respond to threat by mutating. Late in the afternoon, Marcus Aurelius Cato, the tribune whose presence felt less rigid than the others, returned to her tent without announcement. His expression was measured, but something behind it hinted at urgency. "The legatus believes the network is already collapsing," he said in Latin, lowering his voice though no one else was present inside. "He assumes fear will scatter what remains." "And you?" Brenia asked evenly. "I believe fear can consolidate resistance as easily as it can destroy it." His honesty unsettled her more than open hostility would have. Rome was not monolithic. It contained ambition, doubt, greed, ideological fracture. Some officers saw Gaul and Britannia as provinces to integrate. Others viewed them solely as resources to drain. Scipio belonged to the latter camp. "You came for confirmation," she said quietly. Cato held her gaze. "Is there still a functioning channel, something beyond what your brother revealed?" There it was again, the same question approached from a different angle. Curiosity layered over insecurity. Rome did not know how deep the roots extended, and that uncertainty gnawed at its commanders. Brenia weighed her response carefully. Shock from Cadix's betrayal had hardened into calculation. She could deny outright, but denial carried no leverage. She could confirm, but confirmation risked accelerating suppression. "There are embers," she said finally. "Whether they ignite depends on how Rome behaves." Cato's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. He understood the implication. Brutality would radicalize what remained. Measured integration might neutralize it. "Scipio will not soften," Cato admitted. "He believes dominance must be absolute." "And absolute dominance creates absolute enemies," Brenia replied. Outside, Roman soldiers drilled in tight formation, shields rising and locking with mechanical precision. The empire's strength lay in order, in predictability, in the assurance that force, once applied, would yield submission. But beneath that order lay fragility. If even a fraction of the Druid network remained operational, it could feed intelligence to neighboring tribes, it could disrupt supply routes, it could inspire myth. Rome's greatest fear was not open rebellion, it was sustained, invisible resistance. Cato rose from the stool. "If I can restrain Scipio's harsher measures temporarily, will you consider communication?" It was not quite an alliance, not quite betrayal. It was an opening. "Restraint," Brenia said quietly, "would signal possibility." He nodded once and left. Alone again, Brenia allowed herself a measured breath. Fear remained. It lived in her muscles, in the awareness of guards stationed beyond the canvas. Greed still drove Roman ambition. Surprise had reshaped her strategy after the map's revelation. Insecurity lingered on both sides. But now a challenge emerged larger than her individual survival. If the network endured, even partially, it represented more than resistance. It represented continuity, memory refusing erasure. Rome had burned the grove to demonstrate supremacy. It did not yet realize it had ignited something far more difficult to extinguish. And somewhere beyond the perimeter, beyond the orderly geometry of tents and standards, messages were already moving through the countryside. Quietly, deliberately, waiting. The choice before sunset. A queen would either save her sons or condemn an entire hidden world. Rome demanded obedience.
History demanded sacrifice. The sky above the Roman camp burned a dull iron red as the sun began its slow descent, and Brenia understood that time had narrowed into a blade. Scipio had given her until sunset to confirm the final fragments of the Druid network, the contact codes, the human links, the living arteries that still pulsed beneath Roman occupation. After sunset, negotiation would end. After sunset, she would become spectacle. Guards stood closer to her tent now. The courtesy of distance had vanished. Rome's patience was thinning. Inside, Brenia sat motionless, but her thoughts moved with violent clarity. Fear pressed against her ribs, not for herself, but for her sons. Somewhere beyond the Roman perimeter, hidden within layers of secrecy, 2 boys carried the last unbroken claim to Nurvian sovereignty. If she surrendered the network, Scipio might spare them. He had implied as much, a controlled life in a Roman household, educated, fed, erased. If she refused, their lives might become leverage for torture she could not endure. Greed motivated Scipio, but not solely for gold. He wanted stability. He wanted to return to Rome with more than trophies. He wanted certainty that no uprising would threaten his legacy. The network represented insecurity in his command. As long as it existed, his victory remained incomplete. Cato returned once more before the sun lowered fully. He did not sit this time. Urgency sharpened his posture. "He's preparing a public example," he said quietly. "If you refuse, he will make you visible, painfully visible." Brenia absorbed the information without outward reaction. "And if I cooperate?" "You preserve yourself, possibly your sons, but the network will be dismantled within months. The countryside will be pacified by force." Pacified, the Roman word for cultural suffocation. Shock had long since burned away. What remained was calculation layered over memory. She thought of the grove before it fell, the low chanting beneath ancient branches, the coded rituals passed from generation to generation. She thought of her people's belief that sovereignty was not merely territory, but identity. Once identity fractured, land followed. Past belief in heroic martyrdom felt naive now. Dying defiantly achieved nothing if it extinguished future resistance. Living dishonorably might secure bloodline survival, but at what cost? Cato watched her wrestle with the impossible arithmetic. "If the network survives," he added carefully, "it needs time. Time to reorganize, time to shift roots. You may be able to provide that time without giving Scipio what he truly wants." "How?" she asked. "Partial truth. Outdated channels. Enough cooperation to delay harsher action." Delay. The word sparked something sharp and dangerous. Delay meant breathing space. Delay meant survival stretched thin but unbroken. It also meant deception, sharpened to a razor's edge. If exposed, retaliation would be immediate and merciless. Outside, the Roman standard snapped violently in the evening wind, its eagle casting a long shadow across the camp. Authority, rigid and gleaming, believed itself eternal. Inside the tent, Brenia rose slowly. She would not surrender the living arteries of her people, but neither would she refuse outright. She would offer fragments, channels already abandoned, codes already altered. She would feed Scipio enough confirmation to keep him cautious, enough progress to restrain public humiliation, enough complexity to slow the machine. Surprise would be her weapon. Insecurity would be his.
As the sun dipped lower, she felt the weight of the coming confrontation settle into her bones. Challenge defined the moment, not only survival, but the preservation of something intangible yet vital. When the guards escorted her once more to Scipio's command tent, the sky had darkened to bruised violet. Officers stood gathered inside, waiting to witness the queen's decision. Wine cups glinted in lamplight. Anticipation thickened the air. Scipio met her gaze without warmth. "Your answer." Curiosity flickered in his eyes, though he masked it with authority. Brenia inclined her head just enough to suggest submission, not surrender. "I will give you what you need, but not what you expect." A murmur rippled through the tent. Scipio's expression hardened. "Explain." She did. And as she spoke, careful to balance truth with obsolescence, she understood something chillingly clear. This was no longer a battle for territory. It was a battle for time. And in wars of endurance, time could be more dangerous than swords. The silence Rome could not conquer. Empires record their victories. They rarely record what survives beneath them. And sometimes survival is the quietest rebellion of all. The night Brenia made her final decision did not end in spectacle. It ended in stillness. Scipio listened to every word she offered, his face unreadable beneath the lamplight. She spoke of routes that had once been vital but were already abandoned. She described safe houses emptied weeks before the battle. She confirmed fragments Caddoc had given them, reinforcing credibility while subtly redirecting attention toward corridors already severed. It was a dangerous balance, truth wrapped in obsolescence. The officers around the table watched her with a mixture of suspicion and reluctant admiration. They expected either collapse or defiance. Instead, they witnessed strategy. When she finished, Scipio leaned back slowly. "If this proves accurate," he said evenly, "your position improves." Improves. The Roman word for postponed degradation. But Brenia had never been playing for comfort. She had been playing for time. Over the next days, search parties rode out. Some returned with empty barns and abandoned huts. Others found minor caches left intentionally visible, offerings planted by the network to satisfy Roman curiosity. Each small success reassured Scipio that progress was being made. Each minor discovery reinforced the illusion of control. Behind that illusion, the real channels shifted. Messengers altered paths, signals changed form, symbols were redrawn. The Druid network compressed further underground, no longer anchored to geography, but to memory and movement. Rome believed it was extinguishing resistance. In truth, it was chasing shadows cast by yesterday's map. Fear never left Brenia. It lived beside her like a second pulse. Every time boots approached her tent, every time a guard's tone hardened, she calculated whether the deception had been uncovered. Greed still governed the Roman machine. Surprise remained her only shield. Cato continued to move quietly through the camp, tempering Scipio's harsher impulses when possible. He never declared allegiance. He never promised protection. But subtle restraint slowed the spiral toward public humiliation. In Rome, factions always competed. Ambition rarely aligned perfectly. Brenia had learned to navigate those fractures. Weeks passed. Her sons were not found. That absence, more than anything, unsettled Scipio. Insecurity began to edge his composure. The idea that heirs of a conquered tribe might grow in obscurity, beyond Roman oversight, troubled him deeply. Control demanded visibility. One evening, as autumn began to soften the air, Scipio summoned her alone. "The network is fading," he said. "Our patrols encounter less resistance." He spoke with confidence, but Brenia recognized doubt beneath it. "You have what you wanted," she replied calmly. "Stability. For now." He studied her for a long moment. "You could have chosen martyrdom. Instead, you chose survival." She did not answer immediately. Martyrdom would have been simple, a clean end, a story Rome could parade as proof of dominance. Survival was messier. Survival required compromise, deception, endurance. "Survival," she said quietly, "is not submission." Scipio's expression flickered. Annoyance, perhaps even reluctant respect. He dismissed her without further threat. Years later, Roman historians would write of the Nurvi as subdued, of the grove destroyed, of treasures seized and resistance pacified. They would record troop movements, tribute totals, administrative reforms. They would praise discipline and inevitability. They would not record the altered roots that preserved a hidden current of identity. They would not record the queen who fed Rome fragments while shielding the core. They would not record the boys who grew to adulthood under different names in distant territories, carrying stories of sovereignty disguised as folklore. Empires write with ink. Memory writes with blood and whisper. Brenia did not witness the long-term consequences of her gamble. She lived under guarded watch for years, transferred quietly from military custody to controlled residence far from her homeland. She was never paraded in chains through Rome, never displayed as conquered spectacle. Her usefulness had been too strategic, her compliance too measured. She became, in Roman documentation, a footnote. But beneath that footnote, something endured. The Druid network did not vanish. It adapted. It merged with new movements. It carried forward fragments of language, ritual, belief, not loudly, not rebelliously in the open, but steadily. Rome conquered land. It never fully conquered memory. And that was the truth no triumph ever celebrated. Because what Roman soldiers did to the wives of defeated tribal chiefs was indeed unspeakable. But what some of those women did in response, Rome never truly understood.